Hi, I'm Brian and welcome back to our series Primed and Loaded. Today we're going to be introducing you to the Snaphaunce ignition system. So come on inside and let's take a look. We've discussed so far in the series the match lock and the wheel lock ignition system. So today we're going to talk about the next step in the evolution of firearms. And of course, while gunpowder's been around in Western Europe for centuries by this point, it's really the 16th century where you see small arms take off for the infantry. Starting, of course, with the matchlock, which hangs around for quite a while because of its simplicity, but then closely followed by the wheel lock, and then hot on the heels of the wheel lock, we have the Snaphaunce, the first in a line of progression of flint fire weapons that will lead us eventually to what a lot of us today refer to as the flintlock. Now, this system, much like the wheel lock before it, you will be found on a wide variety of firearms. You're looking at personal sporting weapons, mostly in the hands of the upper classes, pistols of a wide description, and heavier bore military weapons and all that sort of thing. What we're looking at today is a fowling piece, which is actually one of the weapons we specifically have reference to coming to Virginia in the early years. And as you may have noticed in our intro there, evidenced that it's a fowling piece by the length of the barrel. The idea with that length, of course, trying to keep the spread of the bird shot that you would most commonly be using in your fowling piece tighter a little further. But as I said, you can see this lock mechanism used on all sorts of different firearms. So to go ahead and get a closer look at it, let's take the lock plate off, get in there, and see what makes it tick. So before we actually open this up, let's take a look at the external portions of the system. At first glance, of course, as compared to, say, the matchlock, you can see there's already a lot more going on here. The most important components on the outside here, of course, are going to be the cock, pan cover, and battery. And to start with, cock is what is going to carry the flint, which is, of course, one half of the sparking system. Referred to as a cock because of its physical resemblance, of course, to a cockerel or rooster. The pan cover, going to protect the priming powder, as with any of these systems, of course, while the weapon is being loaded and carried. And then we have the battery, which is carrying the hardened steel face against which the flint will strike to generate the spark, which also has its own external spring to help that battery maintain position so that it can in fact be struck. So when the trigger is pulled, the cock is released to slam that flint into the steel face of the battery to generate the spark to ignite the priming powder. Let's get inside of our Snaphaunce. I'm going to start by removing the lock plate screws. Now, it is worth noting that as firearms really evolved to take on a more central role in Western European combat, and as they become, therefore, much more numerous, people start looking for a more practical way to field them. Simple and reliable as the matchlock is, you do have that inconvenience of having to carry burning rope around wherever you want to use the weapon. And so folks start looking for an alternative to that. And of course, alternatives show up immediately with the wheel lock and now our Snaphaunce. But the trick is going to be finding a system that's practical for the average soldier, which is going to require a balance of functionality and dependability, as well as expense, ease of manufacture, ease of maintenance, all that sort of thing. So let's dive in here, take a closer look at our Snaphaunce from that perspective. So you can see, again, a lot going on here, a lot of components, a lot of parts that all have to work together in unison. And our most, the biggest stuff, again, we've got our cock carrying the flint, the battery with the steel face, the pan cover here, the main spring. This is, of course, what's going to generate the power necessary to ignite the gunpowder. This spring is what's going to be throwing that cock forward to slam that flint against the steel of the battery. The main spring linked into the tumbler here. The tumbler itself actually a portion of the cock. And we've got our Sear Assembly, so essentially the triggering assembly does not actually directly connect to the tumbler. It connects to a catch on the outside of the lock mechanism and will catch the cock on the outside. So let's go ahead and get in there and take a closer look at the Sear Assembly. So let's get a little closer look at our Sear Assembly. This is, of course, the actual triggering mechanism. We have the sear here, and the triggering release here. The trigger itself is actually a single piece of metal that hinges on a pin, and that is integral with the gun stock itself, so not visible here. And here we've got the sear, the release, and the two springs that hold them in place. Both of these little leaf springs held in place by a single screw. The top spring is keeping the sear in place, the bottom spring there keeping the release in place. And this whole system built to actuate this little catch on the outside here. This is where the whole system is actually released. So when the cock is bent, there's a little notch in here to come around and hang up on that catch, and then releasing that catch is what's going to allow the cock to slam forward, and that is done, of course, with the release and sear. You can see that little catch moving there. Now, the cock itself is connected through its pivot point and a pierced hole in the lock plate to the tumbler here. And the tumbler, of course, is what takes the tension from the mainspring. Right. Now, the mainspring is anchored here, and when the cock is bent, you can see now the spring compressed, again, riding on that tumbler, so that when it's released, when that little catch is released, the spring forces that tumbler down, which then, of course, pivots the cock and swings it forward. Now, also tied into the tumbler and the cock itself is this little push rod right in here, which you can see travels all the way up underneath the pan, which in this instance is integral with the lock rather than the barrel. And that little push rod goes all the way up to this assembly here, which is actually what opens the pan cover for us as the cock falls. So the cock falling is literally physically pushing the pan cover open, hinging on the little screw here, and this piece simply a keeper to keep that in place. This is going to be one of the potential failings of the Snaphaunce in a combat situation. If this assembly is too tight, then it's not going to open the way it should. It won't open in time. It won't open all the way. It may not even open at all. If this assembly gets too loose, then the pan cover will simply flop open at the wrong time and spill your priming powder, or let the weather in, or what have you. So this is going to be one of the weak points of the Snaphaunce system. So now let's take a look at how all of this works together. We'll start by bending the cock. There is no half-cocked position with this. That is fully cocked. Some of these mechanisms will have a back lock, a physical block that catches the Sear assembly, but this particular one does not. So it is fully cocked at this point. You would then, of course, prime the pan, close the pan cover, and then we will bend the battery, and the system is ready to go. So when we press the release, which of course normally be done by the trigger, we'll drop that cock onto the battery. And we have the spark, which would of course fall into the pan to ignite the powder, and you can see now that pan cover out of the way. Now that we've checked out its inner workings, we're going to reassemble the weapon and take it out to shoot. We'll see exactly how all of these components work together. Now with the weapon reassembled and ready for operation, we're going to take a look at the actual ignition. So to prepare that, that's going to start with bending the cock to the full cock position. There's no half cock like there will be with later evolutions of this technology. No physical safety. Some of these do have a back lock system that physically blocks the sear, but this weapon does not. It's not a standard feature. Yeah, so full cock position, and we'll start by priming the pan. It's a little bit of powder from our priming flask into the pan. Close the pan cover. Make sure there's no excess powder outside the pan, and for now we're just going to flash the pan to look at the ignition itself. So we'll skip charging the barrel, bring the battery up, and now we're ready to go. Squeezing the trigger, we'll release that big main spring to slam the cock forward, drive the flint into the steel face of the battery to generate the spark to ignite our powder. And there we have it. And that flash, of course, going to pass through a small hole called a vent into the breech of the barrel to ignite the main charge and propel the ball. As a fouling piece, of course, this is intended for use with birdshot, but as a smooth bore, as with most of the arms in use in this time period, sporting or military, smooth bore, of course, gives you flexibility to use all sorts of different types of ammunition. And for us today, of course, here in the middle of our recreated site, we'll be skipping a live projectile and just using a paper wad. To actually go through the entire loading process, again, bend the cock to full cock position. Bring up our priming flask and prime the pan. Close the pan cover. Make sure there's no excess powder. Cast the weapon about. Pick up our charger, again, one measured charge of powder, and empty that powder straight on down the barrel. Normally then, of course, your projectile would be going in on top of it. Today, once again, using a paper wad to achieve the compression necessary for the weapon to work properly. Using our scouring stick to make sure that everything is seated all the way at the breech. And return our scouring stick. Recover the weapon. Bend the battery. We are ready to go. And there we have the operation of our Snaphaunce. The operating system works pretty well, all things considered, but of course with more complexity comes more potential for things to go wrong. The flint striking the steel to generate a spark, the spark falling on the powder, the pan cover opening in time when it is in a separate paired system. All of these things have the potential to cause misfire, especially under adverse conditions, as the flint dulls, as the whole system gets fouled with the fouling the gunpowder leaves behind as it burns. But that being said, even with the added expense of the weapon and a higher potential for misfires compared to something like the matchlock, the system gains popularity rapidly in Europe, but especially from what we see here in Virginia. As you transition, especially from the martial law period in which the Virginia Company is providing equipment to everyone that doesn't already have it, to now the Virginia General Assembly period, 1619 and onwards, you see this requirement for landowners to own firearms and be able to provide firearms to all those whom they employ. And we see this ever-growing number of Snaphaunces in the colony. By the early 1620s, with the transition from Virginia Company administration to royal administration in the colony, we see a census essentially taken, which is counting not only people but equipment in the colony. And that inventory is showing a tremendous number of Snaphaunces. And it makes a certain amount of sense when you look at it. If you're equipping an army for mass use on the battlefields of Europe, you're looking for cheap, durable, reliable. If you yourself are out on the frontier and you're looking for a firearm, yeah, you want something that's going to work well, but you've got other concerns. If you're working in your tobacco field and you want a firearm close to hand to be ready to use at a moment's notice, that matchlock has got that extra step of having to fiddle around with the slow match, making sure the match is keeping going all day. It's another something that you're constantly consuming with that niter temp rope every hour. And so the Snaphaunce and these other variants of the early flintlocks, it's easier to maintain a constant state of readiness. With the the cock bent and the weapon loaded and primed, it's ready to pick it up, put it to your shoulder, and pull the trigger. And so that is very likely one of the major benefits that the colonists are seeing, and why we see them become so popular here so rapidly, as compared to, say, the major military forces on the continent of Europe, where you see a more slow and gradual introduction of the flint systems, which will eventually, of course, push all of the preceding systems off the battlefield. By about 1700, whether you're looking at the colonies or Europe, the matchlocks, the wheel locks, and almost all of the earlier flintlocks are pretty well gone, replaced by the French lock, or what we today most commonly now refer to as the flintlock. The system is going to be all the way around the most practical for the applications that these firearms begin to be put to, both in civilian use and in military use. Again, they've all got their pros and cons, but the flint system will show itself as the most practical system as the weapons continue to evolve. Well, thanks for tuning in today. If you enjoyed what you saw, remember to like and subscribe, and if you have any questions or comments, please leave those for us below. Check out the Foundation's other social media for additional content. And remember, keep your powder dry.